right, friends. So one of the points that I've really tried to drive home with you guys, and you obviously at this point realize how much I like to repeat myself, has been that there's more than one way to assess something, right? Obviously, like we've talked about, there's more than one way to view something, but how do we assess it in a way that is the best way or closest to the best way? There's any different number of measurements. If you think of, for example, when students apply for college, what their application includes. Their application often includes their SAT score, their high school GPA, any extracurriculars, letters of recommendation, a writing sample. All of these are different assessment strategies or assessment methods. And the question is, okay, well, do we really need all of that? Do we need to see all of that? And the answer kind of is yes, because we're using multiple strategies to try and trying to assess the student's chance of success in college. Sorry, that was like a tongue twister. But when we're doing research, we have to decide, okay, what's the best way to answer the questions that we're dealing with? And for those of you I've met about your dissertations, that's usually my question is, okay, well, what if we were to do this? What if we were to measure that construct in a different way? Is qualitative the best way to do it? Is quantitative? And then within those, what's the best way to answer the question that you're posing? And the slides have a theme of dollar bills, y'all, because obviously so much of this comes down to time and money. That's one of the big things that dictates how we assess things. So we'll talk more about it as we move through. So some things to think about: what are the measures that we're going to use? How available are they? Can we change them? Unobtrusiveness and reactivity, something we've talked about several lectures ago. How do we obtain an unobtrusive measure, and how do we ensure that it's unobtrusive? And basically any of the issues that could kind of come along with all of these, right? And I want you to think of assessment as trying to do the best you can, but expecting to fall short. So very much like being a Christian, right? We try and be as much like Christ as we can, but with the expectation that we will always fall short because of our fallen nature. So in reality, if you think about it, research is actually an extension of your faith. So you're welcome. So some things to think about. To begin with, construct validity, right? And I would invite you to consider a microscope. So if anybody's ever taught biology out there, you'll know how I feel about this. So construct validity is essentially, are you measuring what you intend to measure, right? So if you think of a microscope there, it's a very finely hewn instrument that's meant to measure and observe certain things, right? But it has to be operated correctly in order to be able to do so. So essentially, do you have a tool, a microscope in this case, that will be able to look at certain things, that has the capacity to do so? Your standard, microscope is not going to be able to look at gene sequences, for example, right? Because it just simply doesn't have the capacity. That's where construct validity comes in, and that's connected to sensitivity as well. Does the microscope have the lens sensitivity to capture what you need it to, or will it fall short? When you are picking out an instrument, when you're designing an instrument, when you're deciding how your methodology will come together, is it sensitive enough to pick out nuances between participants, right? So, if you're doing a scale from 1 to 5, for example, a Likert scale of 1 to 5, is that really enough to capture diversity among your participants, or do you need a scale from 1 to 10? All right, and it sounds like a small nuanced detail, but somebody might say, well, you know what, I don't really feel like a 3, but I might select a 7 on a scale. I think 3 is too low and 4 is too high. What if it was a 7? It sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but it happens. And then also psychometric characteristics, we're going to talk more about that too. If you think of the SAT, for example, the SAT is a psychometric exam in that it is an exam that's designed to measure some aspect of your psychological state, in this case, academic capacity and scholastic aptitude, right? So does that test actually measure it well? Think of the students you've had before that didn't do well in the SAT, but are very bright students, right? That's part of the problem. Is the SAT is an excellent measure, but does still fall short because of a variety of different factors. So when we're selecting measures for our research, I've already brought up the SAT. The SAT is excellent because it has a variety of good aspects to it. The first of all is construct validity. And in this case, the question, construct validity is simply, does the item measure what it intends to measure? Which sounds kind of stupid and nuanced, but it actually makes sense. I'm sure you've been in situations, not in this class, of course, but in other classes, and you might have seen teachers do this, where the teacher spends all day long teaching the students A, and then gives them an exam on B, right? In this case, the measurement doesn't really suit the topic, right? You don't want that. If you're teaching A, then you want to assess on A. Same kind of idea with construct validity, right? And essentially, the SAT is good because the SAT has high contra validity in that it does really assess whether or not students are prepared for college, whether or not they have the scholastic aptitude to succeed in college. So I would argue that part of the reason why the SAT is so successful is because the construct validity is quite high, right? And this is very important because I think construct validity, particularly when you're designing your own research, is the most important factor. Is your study overall going to assess what you want it to assess, right? If you think of your research question, all of you had to write a research question to start this whole bad boy off. Does the study provide an answer to that research question? And once again, like I said, it sounds so simplistic, but it's very important to consider, right? So always go back to that. Does this answer my question? If I design it this way, will it answer the question I need to answer? So when it comes to psychometric characteristics, these are really difficult because most of the time it's very hard to measure human beings equally well across different human beings, right? So if you've ever taken any of these psychometric exams, so the SAT is one, IQ tests are another, the Beck Depression Inventory, you can name any number of legitimate psychological tests because they're legitimate, but it's difficult to really assess people well. Something I want you to consider, and it should be bold, I'm sorry, I didn't bold it in this case. Inter-rater reliability is something that we hadn't really spent a lot of time talking about, but if you have, for example, 3 people observing the same thing, are they all going to judge it the same way or evaluate it the same way? So if there's a child who's misbehaving in a classroom and you're observing them, let's say you film the classroom, right? You're observing the video as a principal, the teacher's observing the video as the teacher, and then the parent is observing the video as the parent. Are all 3 of you going to develop the same conclusions and evaluate what happened the same way? Absolutely not. But what you want to do is make sure that you have high inter-rater reliability in order to be able to assess well, right? And so I'm using an example of whichever show you want to watch. It could be The Voice, it could be any number of these, competition shows where, there's a judge that's like, oh, or the other 3 judges will say, 10, 10, 10, and then the 4th judge says 3, and it's like, well, okay, what were you observing that we didn't see, right? I always think of Simon Cowell from American Idol, because he was always like, oh, no, it's a no for me. Well, based on what? Anyway, you get the idea. Sensitivity to the measure, this is super important because we don't think about it a whole lot. But obviously, when you give a measure to a group of people, there's going to be some diversity in the responses. This question really gets at the fact that can it, and I love this term, systematic variation. Does it reflect systematic variation? Basically, does it accommodate everyone? And does it have the sensitivity to capture a diversity of perspectives, opinions, whatever you want to call it, right? And in Texas, being wrong example. There it is. Okay, I'll get to that one in a second, right? So the scale there, right? For especially during the pandemic, I think many of us have a love-hate relationship with our scales because the stress and everything like that has led us to stress eating and maybe stress drinking. And anyway, so the scale has become kind of a negative thing in our family, right? If you buy a cheap scale, my wife sent me out to buy a scale about a year ago, and I bought the cheapest one they had at Walmart. And if you stood on the scale, it might say 160. And you step off of it and step right back on. And it says 173. Right? That's very, very poor sensitivity. You don't really want a scale that does that. You want a scale that if you are to lose weight, it immediately tells you, congratulations, you lost weight. Or if you're trying to get gains, as the young people say, by going to the gym and lifting weights. I've never done this before, but I've heard it's quite thrilling. You want the scale to reflect that you have put on muscle mass, right? So if you gain a pound based on your getting gains, right, you want it to be reflected in the scale. So you want a very sensitive measure. Something that we encounter day in and day out that's not very sensitive, for example, are oil prices. Oh, it cut off the bottom of my little picture there. So it should say regular is an arm, plus is a leg, and the bottom one for premium should say firstborn. But if you've seen this before, I know you have, especially in Texas, when there's a headline that says oil prices crashed yesterday. The price of a barrel dropped X amount yesterday. And then you go to get your gas the next morning, and it's still the same price as it was 2 days ago. And you're like, well, what the heck, man? If oil dropped 25% yesterday, shouldn't my gas prices drop 25%? Yeah, they should. But this is a very insensitive measure. It will drop very quickly, or it will increase very quickly when oil prices shoot up, but will not drop very quickly when they decrease. Poor sensitivity to the measure. Why do I put these in here? Why do I put these transitions? Blah, 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 blah. There we go. All right. So some things about assessment methods and strategies, right? What I would suggest is looking what other people are doing. And I love that so many of you have done this. Use your lit review, use your introduction. Well, how are people measuring similar situations or similar topics as what you want to do? Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't need to. If it's already out there, if there's a great instrument, utilize it or adapt it and use it for your study. Are your subjects unique or are they similar to previous studies? Right? A simple question. Obviously, every subject is going to be unique, but are the participants going to be unique in a way that will make it distinct from other studies? Things like reliability, validity. If you're developing your own instrument, which I totally respect because that's one of my favorite things about research, consider that it's not tested yet for reliability or validity. You don't really know how well it's going to work, and this is going to be part of the analysis. It's also going to be part of your writing. Has to be part of your writing when you go to write all this up. Right? So when you invent something new, great, fabulous, but did it actually measure it well? Right? I will tell you, I invented an instrument one time that did such a poor job in what it was supposed to, I literally had to throw the entire study away and start over. It was 6 months of my life that I will never get back. So cautionary tale, throwing it out there, make sure the validity is there. And then as we've talked about too, and I know you're tired of hearing, operationalization. How do you operationally define the variable you're trying to do? Whether it be an independent variable or a dependent variable, how do you operationalize that in a way that is useful? And as the slide indicates, of course, so much of this comes down to time and money, something that I don't think any of us have quite as much of as we would like to. So standardized measures. We'll go to standardized measures, right? So this is something that's already been out there. And I'll use the SAT, for example, or it could be the Binet IQ test, whatever, right? What's nice about this is they are already kind of gold standard. If I have a student who's applying to go to school at HBU and they're coming from California or they're coming from Maine or they're coming from Florida or whatever, I can say, what is your SAT score? And they most likely have taken the SAT. And I don't have to worry about, oh, well, you know what? That was a Florida SAT. I don't know how that really compares to a Texas SAT, right? Some people might think that, but they don't know standardization. They are just gospel, basically, right? And what's nice about this, if you think of it, I like to use the iceberg method here. If you know anything about icebergs, with most icebergs, the great majority of the ice is actually below the water level. Usually only about 10% of the ice that you can see, the only visible ice is about 10% of the iceberg. About 90% of most of the iceberg is below the water level, right? And that's what this kind of looks like. The SAT administration is gotten to a point where there's so much data backing it up that you are essentially standing on the shoulders of geniuses, right? There's been so much that's validated, you don't really have to worry about it. Your research is essentially nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. So you have that confidence in the instrument that you are utilizing. What you can do is modify, okay? And so in this case, you might actually take an existing measure or instrument and apply it to a unique context, which is fine. Perfectly fine. So if it's an instrument that's been utilized a lot with adults, you might say, well, what if it was with high school seniors, right? Not legally adults yet, but darn close. You can do this. Oh, it was utilized to measure children with a certain disability. Okay, but what if we used it with children with this disability, right? Fine, that sounds good. But you can't necessarily expect similar accuracy, right? Likewise, changing the instrument, restructuring it, using a short form can also have a pretty substantial outcome on the results, right? And also it affects the reliability and the validity. You are more than welcome to change it, of course, but there's a reason why it stands as it is. For example, this gentleman wearing the umbrella hat. Umbrellas are great at keeping the rain off of you, right? However, as a hat, they don't really seem to have the same impactfulness, and they're not going to be great for getting you a date. To be honest with you, there's a lot of negative things that might come along with wearing an umbrella hat, right? Same idea. What's the reason why we carry umbrellas? And umbrellas as a design haven't changed in quite some time? Because they're an excellent design. Modifying them will come with consequences. So if you are to use an instrument that exists, I would consider using the instrument as it exists, as opposed to modifying it to suit the research that you are conducting.